10 years ago, I was a senior in high school and Blizzard released a card game called Hearthstone Heroes of Warcraft. And over those 10 years of Hearthstone, there has been 5,000 cards released in the game. And it got me thinking, what are the top 100 cards in Hearthstone of all time? The way I'm determining this is how relevant and how meta warping the card was during its time in Standard. Because if I look at a card from Classic compared to now, it is not even close. The first thing I did was go through every expansion to see what cards I thought were worthy of making it to the top 100. And depending on the expansion, there were actually a lot of cards that I believe could be eligible. So cutting down this list to only 100 cards was going to be very difficult. This is the page that we've been doing so far. There's just so many good cards. The entire process basically took an entire day, and honestly, condensing these down to 100 cards was insanely difficult. And I honestly wouldn't be surprised if majority of people got a different top 100 cards than I did. Because if you think back at the cards that were released in Classic, maybe Black Rock Mountain, there was no stats for it. It was just remembering what was in the metagame and maybe some personal bias from experience. So you can flame me all you want for my personal list, but here are my cards from 100 to 51. Every single card here was meta relevant, competitively played, and most importantly, saw play throughout the time it was in Standard until it was drastically nerfed or it was rotated. And I think a lot of these cards could be put into the top 50 or higher. I think it just depends on maybe the day you ask me, but I'm pretty satisfied with the list I came up with. It's important to note that a lot of these cards aren't the iteration of the card that I am talking about on this list. For example, the Penflaker version that I'm talking about dealt 1 damage to anything, not only a minion. Let's talk about the top 50 cards here, because this is where we start getting to the absolute big boys of Hearthstone and what I consider the strongest cards in their standard rotation. Number 50, Spirit Claws, one of the most dominant weapons of all time, especially during its days of One Night in Karazhan. It turned out 1 mana deal 9 damage was really good for face damage, but it also helped you develop a board behind it and then deal with your opponent's minions. This card was eventually nerfed from 1 mana to 2, and it saw much less play, but during its time in Karazhan, it was an absolute monster. Number 49, Barnes. If you did play during One Night in Karazhan, you probably remember this legendary because of its ability of cheating out another legendary called Yashiraj. And during its time, summoning that amount of stats in the early game was very good, and a lot of decks did utilize this to cheat out big stuff. Barnes was probably one of the most hated cards of all time, but the thing is, it wasn't nerfed in Standard, it was actually nerfed in Wild, which is one of the reasons why I don't think I could put it any higher. But don't get it twisted, Barnes was still really good in the early game and could win games strictly on its own. Number 48, Reno Jackson. A lot of you are probably surprised that I put it this far down, but remember, top 50 cards is nothing to scoff at. That's still incredible. Not only did Reno make one of the most popular Hearthstone archetypes with Highlander, it's beloved by the community, and it is a card that is continuously referenced through Hearthstone's life cycle. There's been countless iterations of this card, and we're probably going to see one of those higher on this list. Number 47, Il'gynoth. Il'gynoth is a Demon Hunter legendary that was introduced much later into the game because, well, Demon Hunter wasn't introduced until 2020. This card had the really unique win condition of making all of your lifesteal cards deal damage, and in a class like Demon Hunter, that is a very powerful effect. Most importantly, this is one of the few cards on this list that was able to win 2 world championships back to back. And I think that says a lot about a card more than anything else of how powerful it could be. Also, I'm pretty confident, other than just like Infinite Sorcerer's Apprentice Mage, this is the card that enabled the most deadly combo to date where you couldn't really out heal it. Number 46, Sire Denathrius. This is a card that I never expected to be as good as it was, but it turned out that this was an absolute staple in the metagame that it was introduced in. This is the type of card that you would want in the early game as much as possible to sit in your hand so it can infuse for an insane amount of damage, especially when you combo it with Bran Bronzebeard. This was basically an OTK waiting to happen. This card was played so much in the meta that eventually they had to nerf it from endlessly infuse 1 to 2, and the card saw a significantly less amount of play. But during its time when it was unnerfed in Standard, it was very rare that you saw a deck that didn't want to play it. Number 45, Wildpaw Gnoll. This gets an honorary mention because of a rule change that it required the devs to do for Thief cards. See, you may notice that it says non-rogue class card on it, and that's because of an interaction with another card, Maestra the Masquerade. When this card was released in United and Stormwind, a lot of people thought Maestra was going to be a straight meme, but the way the card interacted with Gnoll was very oppressive. With Maestra in your deck, you would start the game as a different class, meaning every rogue card that you ended up drawing would actually discount the Gnolls, and you would be able to cheat these out very, very fast. released. They absolutely warped the game around it. Noel saw multiple changes and the card stopped seeing as much play. But for that metagame, it was like the only deck you could see. Number 44, Tuskar Totemic. Back in the day, this card used to say summon a random totem, not a random basic totem. And if you ended up getting the 3/4 totem golem on top of this card, it was backbreaking for so many decks and they could just snowball the game out of control. And obviously this card got nerfed and it saw significantly less play. At 43, I have Giggling Inventor. When this card was first released, it was the best card from the Boomsday project at 5 mana. Every single deck ran it. If you were an aggro deck, you could buff the minions, and if you were a control deck, you slowed the game down quite a bit. And it didn't take too long for this card to go from 5 mana all the way up to 7. Number 42, I have Dragon Queen Alexstrasza. One of the most powerful Highlander cards we've ever seen, with the ability of getting 2 dragons for free. And during the time it was released in standard, the dragon pool was pretty great considering it came out in an expansion called Descent of Dragons. Most importantly, when it was first released, it had the ability to generate itself, which got a little crazy. Eventually this card got 2 changes. 1, it couldn't generate itself, and 2, the dragons that it generated cost 1 instead of 0. The second one was actually a really big change because the amount of tempo and value you can get from 0 cost dragons was absolutely absurd. Dragon Queen Alexstrasza still saw a ton of play after both of these nerfs. At number 41, I have Zephyrus the Great. It turned out finding the perfect card was perfect for almost every single game. Decks that had duplicates would put Zephyrus in their deck because of its payoff, and classes that normally didn't get a Highlander payoff would try to go Highlander just for this card. The effect is obviously one of the most unique cards ever introduced into Hearthstone, and it saw play throughout its entire time in standard. And it was one of the main reasons, alongside Dragon Queen Alexstrasza, why Highlander was so prevalent. At number 40, I have Dr. Boob Mad Genius. This is the first hero card on this list, and this one definitely deserves it because during its time in Rise of Shadows, the entire metagame was revolved around this card. It led to a metagame that was super control heavy, and it was basically warrior mirror matches, and whoever drew Dr. Boom first generally won. It's very rare that a single card can warp the metagame entirely around it, and Dr. Boom further cemented itself as one of the most powerful figures in all of Hearthstone history. If you were playing around in this meta, people would tech in Archivist Elysiana just to have an advantage in the fatigue matchup. Think about the last time you heard that in a game of Hearthstone. At number 39, I have Mysterious Challenger. For those of you who didn't play back in the days of TGT, Paladin was basically the only class, and it was because of this card right here. Secret Paladin's curve was really great, but the nail in the coffin often was Mysterious Challenger. Obviously, the body was pretty great for its time, the effect was amazing, but most importantly, the secrets would require your opponent to play suboptimally, getting you so far ahead that you would just win games from it. It also has one of the most iconic voice lines of all time.
None of your business.
But this isn't what this tier list is on. At number 38, I have Anubricon. I often say the best thing you could do in a card game is mana cheating, and this card enabled mana cheating at an extreme level. This card had to be changed twice because of how powerful this effect was, and it was also for Druid, which had a lot of ways of not only gaining armor, but abusing this. This was a very powerful effect. At number 37, I have Dr. Boom. During its time in Goblins vs. Gnomes, 7-drops were severely lacking, and Dr. Boom basically filled that void until he rotated. A lot of decks would just auto-include it into their list because of how powerful it was against a lot of the other cards, and most importantly, it was a game-winning card. It was so prevalent that people ran Big Game Hunter just to have an answer for it consistently because it was seen so often in the metagame. The only reason he is not higher is because there are other cards on this list that were more meta warping than he was. At number 36, I have Warsong Commander. Warsong Commander enabled one of the best decks of all time with Grim Patron Warrior, and Warsong Commander allowed that deck to be so powerful that they had to take it behind the Bard and give it the old Yeller. But before that nerf, Warsong Commander enabled Grim Patron Warrior to be one of, if not the best deck during its time, and there's no way the deck would have been that successful without a card like this. Also, if I was counting beta versions of cards, this might be the strongest card of all time. At number 35, I'm putting Shutterwalk. This is without a doubt the best card that Shaman has has ever received. The ability to repeat all of your battle cries is obviously a very strong win condition. When it was first released, the animation times would take so long that people would uninstall the game because of it, and most importantly, it never had a cap on the amount of battle cries it could reproduce. It didn't take long for Blizzard to realize that that was a huge mistake, and they made it so there's a cap of 20 battle cries and the animations were sped up. This card single-handedly allowed Shaman to be a playable class for 2 years. At number 34, I'm putting Edwin Van Cleef. Edwin Van Cleef is a card that saw play at every World Championship when it was in Standard, which says a lot about the card itself, but honestly, it can win games pretty quickly on turn 2 or 3, depending on what your opening hand was. And this wasn't later in the Standard format, this was during Classic. This card could single-handedly win you a game on turn 3 because some classes just couldn't deal with it. But Edwin was truly at its best when another card, Foxy Fraud, was introduced during Dark Moon Fair. This card enabled a pretty spicy opener that allowed a 3-mana Edwin Van Cleef to be absolutely disgusting. And shortly after, it was nerfed to 4 mana, which is horrendous to look at, and then unnerfed soon after because it was rotating out of Standard. At number 33, I'm putting Bran Bronzebeard. When this card was first introduced during the League of Explorers, it was okay, but I wouldn't even consider that time frame because the team brought him back during 2022. During his return, he showcased how powerful doubling battle cries truly is, and he allowed some really degenerate combos. Cards got nerfed because of this card. I don't know why they just didn't nerf him directly. At number 32, I'm putting Lotheb. In my opinion, this is the best 5-drop Hearthstone has ever printed, and it came out in 2014. The effect was so good that literally every single deck during his time would run him, and Lotheb easily became the reason why you would win a game. In an aggro deck, you could just outright stop your opponent from clearing the board. Against the combo deck, you could stop them from playing the game. If he was in Standard today, he would be played 100%. At number 31, I'm putting Flash of Lightning. At 2 mana, this card enabled one of the fastest combo decks we've ever seen in the history of Hearthstone with Nature Shaman. Due to the pool of cards in the Standard format out of rotation during Wizbank's workshop, it was extremely easy to win after playing this card on turn 3. It is extremely rare that a single spell can enable such a powerful OTK that early on. Eventually, this card was nerfed to 3 mana, and with more nature spells added to the pool, it made the burn deck less consistent. But for a little bit there, this might have been the best combo deck ever made. At number 30, I'm putting Galakrond, more specifically the Shaman version of it. The Shaman version of Galakrond allowed the class to be the most dominant version of it that we've ever seen before. Not only was this because of Galakrond, but all the invoke cards that were related to it. And the only reason this is not higher is because I have to consider this as an entire package, but there's no way that I cannot mention this version of Galakrond. It was definitely the strongest deck at the time and definitely a contender for the best deck ever. At number 29, I'm putting Yogg-Saron, Hope's End. Old Gods brought a lot of really powerful legendaries, but there was no card like Yogg-Saron. A lot of people thought this card was going to be horrific when it first came out, but it turned out at its worst case scenario, it was just an emergency button. And its presence was so high at a competitive level that they had to nerf it extremely hard because the entire game was warped around this singular card. They made it so that if Yogg-Saron ended his own life during the chain of spells would stop. And that was a really significant nerf where Yogg-Saron didn't see a lot of play after that. At 28 and 27, I'm putting Shadow Step and Preparation. I'm going to talk about both of these at the same time due to the amount of nonsense this has allowed Rogue to do over the years. Both of these have been pretty core throughout Rogue's history, and most importantly has allowed really degenerate stuff to happen. It is also virtually impossible to really tell when the peak of these cards were. Preparation was nerfed during Rise of Shadows because they realized 3 mana at that time was disgusting, and for some reason, Shadow Step has never been nerfed, and I have no idea why. At 26, I'm putting Leroy Jenkins. This is another card that has seen so much play throughout the years, but this time it's actually easier to find its peak, and that was before it was nerfed in Naxxramas from 4 mana to 5 mana. But even after the card was nerfed, it was basically an auto include for any deck that needed a finisher, and sometimes it got even stronger when other cards allowed it to be reduced to 0 mana. In my opinion, the strongest it's ever been was during Miracle Rogue and Classic because it fundamentally made that deck a strong archetype, and without it, I don't know if that deck would have existed. At number 25, I'm putting Secret Passage. This is the best card draw effect Hearthstone has ever seen and probably will see. At release, it was a 1 mana draw 5, and after being nerfed, it was only changed to draw 4 cards, and it was still absolutely disgusting. And just like Shadow Step and Preparation, it is hard to tell when this card truly hit its peak, and in my opinion, other than one card you'll see later on in in this list, this is the best card Rogue has ever received. At number 24, I'm putting Call to Arms. This was a card released in Kobolds and Catacombs, but it didn't really see its potential until the Witchwood. When even Paladin was a tier 1 deck, it was because of this card single-handedly. 4 mana to draw 3 cards from your deck and play them is an insane amount of mana cheat, especially during 2018 Hearthstone. It didn't take long for this card to get nerfed to 5 mana, and then it saw play in Odd Paladin. This card was bonkers. At number 23, I'm putting Final Showdown. Final Showdown is the first quest line here from United and Stormwind, and oddly, this is one that was considered one of the worst when these were first revealed. But the weird thing about Final Showdown is decks would often run it just for the first part of it, because it turned out just reducing cards by 1 mana was extremely powerful in a deck that drew a ton of cards. And obviously, the quest reward was very good. Its absolute peak was during March of the Lich King, where it eventually got nerfed to 6 cards on the first proc rather than 4. The card still saw play, but wasn't nearly as good. Number 22, I'm putting Dark Glare. This card allowed Warlock to do insane turns with the help of self-damaging cards because it used to give you 2 mana every time you hurt yourself. And with the help of Flesh Giant, Warlock would win a game before you could even respawn. Mana cheating is the best thing you could do in Hearthstone, and this card provided a ton of it. And obviously this card got nerfed, but then it got nerfed again a whole year later. And in Wild right now, this card's an absolute menace. At number 21, I'm putting Tunnel Trog, an insane aggro card that was the backbone of Shaman during One Night in Karazhan's Tyranny. If the card was played on turn 1, it was a must answer card because of how fast it would kill you with overload effects. This in tandem with how fast Shaman would kill you made it an absolute menace, and it's one of the best aggro cards we've ever seen. And this is one of the fundamental reasons why Shaman was warping the meta against it. Okay, now that we got all the bad cards out of the way, we finally hit the big boys. And at this point, I'm probably getting death threats in the comments, but if you've gotten this far in the video, I would appreciate a subscription. At number 20, Reno the Lone Ranger, the first neutral hero card ever introduced into Hearthstone, and it only took them 10 years. Not only is this the best Highlander card ever introduced, but they made a change to Highlander cards because every non-Highlander card wanted to run this. They made it so that your deck has to start with no duplicates, so you couldn't just cycle through your deck to find Reno as fast as possible. It goes without saying that poofing your opponent's board and forcing them to only play 1 minion after is a very strong tempo play, and often when this card is played, the game is over. The only reason this is not higher is because it's 8 mana. At number 19, I'm putting Corridor Creeper, the sleeper of Kobolds and Catacombs. Every content creator at the time didn't believe that this was going to be a playable card, but obviously they didn't realize how fast this was going to cost 0 mana, and playing a 0 mana 5/5 in Kobolds and Catacombs was broken. It forced the metagame to revolve around this card until they finally nerfed it to a 2/5. But if you played during this time, you saw Corridor Creeper every single game. But the power level only goes up from there because at 18, I'm putting Incanter's Flow. More specifically, when it was at 2 mana. 2 mana to produce your whole deck by 1, and you would put this in a deck with only spells, was enough to basically lose the game the second you saw it getting played. And this wasn't a legendary effect. You could play this twice. And with the help of a card called Refreshing Springwater, you were able to get more mana for drawing cards, and the deck would just chain itself to kill you before you even had a chance. This card was not nerfed once, but twice to 4 mana. And even at 4 mana, the card was still played. Speaking of mana cheat, our next card at number 17 is Kalthos Sunstrider. In its original state, every third spell was 0 mana. And like I've said before countless times, mana cheating is really good. And with classes that had a ton of draw like Demon Hunter and Druid could really abuse this effect. And as soon as there was enough spells to work with this card, it was promptly nerfed so every third spell would cost 1. And fun fact, when this card finally rotated, they reverted it back to its original state, and you could win a game in Wild on turn 1. Pretty awesome card if I do say so myself. When I'm playing it, of course. Up next is probably my favorite card ever, Prince Renethal at 16. I don't think there's ever really been a card like this that changed Hearthstone in such a positive way, at least in my opinion. Changing your hero's life to 40 at the cost of putting 40 cards in your deck was a really big change for Hearthstone, especially in 2022. The reason why this card is so high up on the list is not because a 3 mana 3/4 really warped the game around it. It was more that the effect was so powerful that almost every single class decided to use it because it turned out to be so strong. And unfortunately, the Hearthstone team decided that games were going on for a little bit too long, so they nerfed the card from 40 life to 35. But the card was still played quite a lot, and I honestly think in the most recent times of Hearthstone, this is a lot of people's favorite card. Now going from a card that I absolutely love to a card that I absolutely despised. At number 15, I'm putting the Caverns Below from Un'Goro. This singular card polarized the entire metagame until it was nerfed during Journey to Un'Goro. And it's very rare that a singular spell can decide the metagame like that. It's not like this is an aggro minion like Tunnel Trog, but it absolutely came down to whether or not you could out aggro the Caverns Below, or you just lost if you were playing anything slower. The game was decided exactly on turn 1, and it was pretty miserable if you wanted to play anything else. And due to the slower balance cadence from the older Hearthstone team, it actually did take a little bit for this card to be nerfed, from going to 4 minions with the same name to 5 minions with the same name. That was a pretty significant nerf, but it was still played after that. The next card I'm a little embarrassed about, because when they first revealed it, I thought it was gonna be horrible, and that's with Rude Mythalrod at 14. This card was released at 3 mana, and I thought to myself, at 3 mana, there's no way a Warlock is gonna wanna play that. I was completely wrong. At 3 mana, it was way more mana cheating than I was expecting due to other draw cards that Warlock had available, and the potential of reducing 10 mana twice for 3 mana was absolutely insane. And obviously this card was nerfed. At 4 mana, this card was still very good, and at 5 mana, this card was still very good. It's hard to really show you how powerful this card was because it's just a mana reducing effect, but in my opinion, this is Warlock's second best card they've ever gotten. The first one we'll be seeing shortly. At number 13, I'm putting Drekthar. For the same reasons that Call to Arms was good, Drekthar was the exact same thing, but you could cheat out even better minions. But also it was a guaranteed 4/4 body, and it was neutral. The singular card warped the entire metagame around it, and it didn't take long for Blizzard to nerf it, making it summon 1 minion instead of 2. And after that nerf, this card basically died. But there was one card that was even stronger from this expansion, and that is Iron Deep Trog at number 12. In its original state, the card read after your opponent casts a spell, summon a copy of this, which means any enchantment such as a buff would be transferred over to the new copy, which could snowball really quickly. I don't think I really have to go into why that is so broken. It didn't take long for the development team to nerf this card to the current iteration it is, but the next card was nerfed even faster. In fact, this is the fastest any card has been nerfed. Skull of Gul'dan at number 11. When Demon Hunter was released, it was released in an absurd state, and there were 4 cards that were so powerful the Hearthstone team had to nerf them in 24 hours. I-Beam, Imprison Anton, Eldrachi Warblades, and in my opinion, the most impactful Skull of Gul'dan allowed Demon Hunter to have the strongest deck of all time in Hearthstone history for a brief 24 hours. The reason why Skull of Gul'dan was so good is because at 5 mana, it was giving you 9 mana back, and most importantly, drawing you 3 cards. And I guess they printed this card because they thought Outcast was going to be a little bit more difficult to set up, but it was surprisingly easy to do in an aggro deck. The only reason Skull of Gul'dan is not higher than any other card on this list is because we truly don't know the potential of this card because it was nerfed so fast. And honestly, you could argue that this is the most impactful card ever printed. But you may have noticed there are still 10 slots above Skull of Gul'dan, and every one of these cards, in my opinion, deserves to be higher than a card that got nerfed in 24 hours. Because we saw how impactful each one of these cards were for a lot longer, and believe me, if you played during these metagames, you knew how great these cards truly were. And that brings me to number 10 with the original Innervate from Classic. The turn 1 Yeti wouldn't have been possible without this card. So many things wouldn't have been possible for Druid without a card like this. And with more powerful cards being added into Hearthstone, this card only got stronger. And again, like Shadow Step or Preparation, it is probably impossible to tell when this card was truly in its prime, but I'm pretty confident to say that it always made Druid relevant despite what the metagame was. Innervate was finally nerfed during Knights of the Frozen Throne to only 1 mana crystal, and it's still played. It's not nearly as good as it used to be, but it's still a pretty good card. The next one might be be shocking for a lot of you guys, but I'm putting Deca Lunacy at number 9. When this card first came out during Dark Moon Fair, it was horrible. The problem with it was mainly the spells that were in the standard pool. By playing this card on turn 2, you often just made your deck worse. So why did I put it at number 9? Because everything changed when rotation happened. Rise of Shadows, Savers of Uldum, and Descent of Dragons all rotated out, and the spell pool from Ashes of Outlands, Scholomance Academy, and Dark Moon Fair were infinitely better for this card. Not to mention the spells from Forge and the Barons were also pretty great for this. And games often came down to one thing: did the mage have this on turn 2? Oh, they did? I guess I lost. If you go look at my entire list, a lot of the cards needed other cards for it to be good. But Deca Lunacy on its own on turn 2 can just solo win a game. This card was so powerful at that time, you didn't even want to play Incanter's Flow before it. But obviously, a card this powerful ended up getting nerfed, and it went from 2 mana to 4 mana. People still tried to play this at 4 mana, but waiting 2 additional turns definitely affected the win rate of this card, and it wasn't nearly as good anymore. But that was definitely for the best. The next card might be the most hated card of all time, with Mindrender Elusia at 8. If you look at the current iteration of this card, it is horrible. It might be one of the worst cards ever printed in the last couple of years. But this is not how that card started. This card started with a completely different effect, and it was also 2 mana. It used to read, swap hands and decks with your opponent until the end of next turn. It didn't take long for people to realize that in an aggro deck, if you just completely empty your hand and play this, your opponent has nothing to respond with. Their top deck will be an aggro card and they just lose, which meant that a priest deck that could win the game on turn 4 was allowed to be played with absolutely no repercussions if this card was in hand. This was a very polarizing and consistent effect, and the Blizzard team acknowledged this pretty quickly, and it was promptly nerfed to 3 mana instead of 2. But as you could probably guess, at 3 mana, the card was still really powerful. And this is the first time on this list that we see a complete redesign because they couldn't balance the effect. And I don't blame them, that's a really powerful effect, but if they put it at like 6 mana, the card would just basically be 400 dust. And now there is Mindrender Elusia, unplayable, and most people are very happy about it. Let's go to a more interesting card with Luna's Pocket Galaxy at number 7. This is a really interesting card because when it first came out, people did try it, but it never really stuck for some reason. Until one day, some Blizzard designer thought it would be a great idea to buff this card from 7 mana to 5 mana. Now, to put it in context, during the Boomsday, this was a much lower power level than we currently see in Hearthstone. So LPG at 5 mana was absolutely absurd. And if I had a nickel for every single time a single mage card just dictated the meta, I'd have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice. And as you could probably guess, this card didn't last at 5 mana too long. It went back to 7 mana, but oddly enough, it being at 5 mana gave people enough confidence to play this card consistently, and it was very powerful for very long. So what do we learn from Deck of Lunacy and Luna's Pocket Galaxy? Maybe don't print powerful cards with Luna in it. I'm just saying. Our very next card is our last class card on this list. At number 6, I'm putting the Demon Seed. Before I get into this card, I first have to redeem myself as a reviewer because I may have messed up on Rune Mythorod, but I said the Demon Seed would be the best card from United and Stormwind, and I'm pretty sure I was right about that. The Demon Seed was such a powerful card that not only did it get nerfed multiple times, but it also indirectly nerfed so many other cards because of how it interacted with them. The reward for this questline of damage you take on your turn damages your opponents instead allowed so many other cards to be just broken. This card basically nerfed Flesh Giant, Dark Lair, Rune Mythorod, Touch of the Nathrazam, and most importantly, Stealer of Souls, a card that was considered useless until the Demon Seed came out. Now, on top of all of these nerfs, the Demon Seed was also hit. The main nerf they went for was making each increment for the questline 10 damage to yourself, so you're taking a total of 30 damage, but the card was still playable. And again, I'm not counting Wild, but this might be the most impactful card the format has ever seen because because it was banned. They could not figure out a way to balance it in standard in wild. And if you go play wild nowadays, this card is a serious issue. We have finally made it, the top 5 of my top 100 Hearthstone list of all time. Every one of these cards is a neutral minion that severely impacted the game like no other card has. And obviously because they're neutral, they would have more presence because they can go in any class. And you could realistically arrange these cards in any way you want, but I believe one of them stands above the rest as the strongest card Hearthstone has ever seen. At number 5 and 4, I'm putting Baku the Moon Eater and Gen Greymane. Both of these cards were introduced at the start of the Witchwood, and a lot of people would say that was their least favorite year of Hearthstone. Some people would say that Shutterwalk was the true problem of the Witchwood, but Gen and Baku enabled a way of playing Hearthstone that honestly was just unfun. But they were so impactful to the metagame that virtually every single deck wanted to play even or odd depending on which one suited them better. And it wasn't just the card themselves that was broken. Gen Greymane being a 6-mana 6/5 wasn't the reason why it was good. It was the start of game effect that would dictate how the game was played because it was just so powerful. Now, not every iteration of Baku or Gen was a problem, but the ones that were really good were the ones you saw at the top of the metagame time and time again. But here's the biggest problem. How do you nerf these cards? If you make Gen Greymane an 8-cost card, it's not going to change it at all. Same with Baku. You could make it 11 mana and it wouldn't make a difference. And Blizzard did not know how to fix this. And instead, their solution was to rotate them early. And because the year of the Witchwood, Boomsday, and Rostakon's Rumble wasn't inherently very powerful, these cards were meta tyrants. And honestly, rotating them early might have saved Hearthstone. But before we had Baku and Gen, we had a small pirate who was in charge with Patches the Pirate at number 3. The worst thing about Patches the Pirate is when it started in your opening hand. All right, at number 2, I'm just kidding. Patches the Pirate enabled almost every single class to go some kind of pirate package so that they could start the game with an extra 1/1 that dealt 1 damage. That doesn't seem very impactful, but believe me, if you played during that metagame, you wouldn't go a single game without hearing, "I'm in charge." And just like Baku and Gen, it's really hard to nerf a card like this because what do you change? The mana cost is irrelevant. The stats kind of matter. I guess you can make it a 0/1, but they ended up just taking away charge. So you just summoned an extra 1/1 and still then it was really good. I think this video from Rarran really showcases how powerful Patches was.
The reason Corridor Creeper is in every deck is because this is in every deck. Every single deck can play Patches. The best version of every single deck, in my opinion, moving forward through Kobolds will be Patches. There's a Tempo Rogue list that's solid. Tier 1 deck. It's an excellent deck. Plays some early dudes, some pirates to get control of the board. Okay, I mean, what's another good deck? Warlock got a lot of new tools. It got a cool, like, Spellstone to gain life with. It got Skull of Manon blah 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 that summons demons and stuff. It got Void Lord. Well, the best Warlock deck's actually just Zoo. And, you know, of course, Warlock doesn't have weapons, but let's put pirates in it anyway, just because we can. What about Druid? Druid got some cool cards. It got Twig. Let's build a cool Druid deck. Let's play Arcane Tyrant, and Ultimate Infestation's so broken, and there's all these good cards and tools. It's a good deck. You know, it's better. Pirates. This is the best Druid deck. Just play some pirates and shit. The All-Spell Hunter deck, Reddit is claiming, is really good now. You're seeing it on ladder a lot. So what's the best hunter deck? What's the best hunter card that I got in the new expansion? Well, actually, it's just Candle Shot, because you needed a way to enable fucking South Sea Deckhand. You know what Mage is good at? Pirates.
It's surprising that all these new cards came into the game and classes still wanted to play Patches the Pirate because it was that powerful. And I don't know if it's shocking or not, but I do find it funny that a 1-mana 1/1 is one of the most powerful cards Hearthstone has ever seen and probably will ever see. At number 2, I'm putting Yogg-Saron Unleash in its original state from the mini set of Titans. Now, if you don't know what a Titan is, it's basically the Planeswalkers of Hearthstone, but Yogg-Saron had 2 really strong abilities. One of them was mind control. The second one was almost a guaranteed board clear. Now, the original state of Yogg-Saron was 15 mana, but it cost 1 less for each spell you've cast this game, which means the metagame in Standard was basically a race to see who could play their Yogg-Saron first. And just like Patches, every single class tried to do this. And again, I am only counting Standard, but at the same time as Standard, Wild was doing the exact same thing. This card dictated how hard Hearthstone was played for a very short period of time. When the Hearthstone team finally nerfed this card, the dev comment really speaks to how powerful Yogg was. Verbatim, it says, unfortunately, it ended up being too overpowered for too long. I truly don't know if there is another card in the game where the dev comment says that. Every card up until now has been very powerful, but there is one card I believe is the strongest card the Hearthstone team has ever released. I have played this game since closed beta, and I have never seen a card take the metagame like Undertaker did during Curse of Naxxramas. But there was one deck and one deck only that was tier S, and that was Undertaker Hunter. If that card was played on turn 1 and you didn't have immediate removal for it, you lost. In fact, you didn't just lose, you got absolutely crushed. People in current Hearthstone are worried about dying on turn 5. You died on turn 1. If that card was played, you lost. See, the problem with Undertaker is that this card scaled with health and attack, which is obviously very snowbally. So if you didn't have immediate removal, the card's health would be too large and you just couldn't kill it anymore. Especially if you were a board-centric deck, this card could not only just keep going face, but trade favorably while your opponent continued to develop stuff behind it. When Blizzard finally got around to nerfing this card, which actually took them a really long time, they made a really smart decision by only nerfing the health buff, which means Undertaker was still playable in aggro, but it just didn't survive everything if you didn't kill it immediately. It'd be really curious to see the stats on Undertaker before it was nerfed, because it might have the highest mulligan win rate we've ever seen in the history of Hearthstone. This is my top 100 list, and I want to remind you, this is based on how impactful it was during its metagame, and I tried really hard to be unbiased, as well as really think about what cards made that much of a difference during its time. I'm sure the comment section of this video is going to be amazing, and I can't wait to read it. If you did get this far, I would appreciate a subscription, maybe a like or a dislike. I'm not really sure how you're feeling at this point, and I'll see you guys in the next one.